here. Let me start to give some key indicators which I think are important. As Alan mentioned, markets need to know the information of what is happening so that we can count markets when they need to be counted. So in terms of production, we are heading towards another record. It's 2,765 million tons, up, this is in cereals, up 58 million tons year to year with respect to previous year. Maize and rice outputs are forecast to reach new records, but a small reduction decline is expected for wheat, which is largely because of reductions in the European Union. In terms of utilization, it is forecasted 2,746 million tons, so up 2.4%, which means that there is a residual which will go to storage. And that's very important because it's not only the good harvest for 2020-21, but also having the stocks. And the stocks by the close of 2021 season are projected to increase by 1.7%. That means 195.5 million tons to an all-time high. That means that we have sufficient stocks. Now, where we need to be looking at carefully things. First, most of the increase in the stocks comes from China. And the rest of the world has increase in the stocks, but the majority is from China. So we are a little bit vulnerable to whatever is the policy of China in terms of accumulation of stocks. The second element where we need to look at carefully is that the stocks that they used to have in pork has been depleted by now. And that's why we are seeing an increase in the demand of pork, and that, of course, put pressure in soybeans and other feedstocks, which we are observing some small increase in prices. The third element where we need to look at, which is related to trade, which is really important, is the issue that although, as it was mentioned, we were able to count markets at the beginning of the COVID-19 and reduce the 22 countries that were already putting some export restrictions, today we are close to zero, basically affecting none of the value of food move across borders. But there is one little problem still, which is the mobility and swaps of vessels. So vessels are moving, but crews are not able to change in all the countries of the world. Major problems are still in Argentina, in Peru, and Colombia, and also in North Africa, which is a net food importing country. So that's something to look at carefully. Is another risk that we need to look at and keep tracking, and we are tracking real time this issue, because it basically means that countries have to put food health measures in the ports to allow these crews to change, because crews cannot be more than 6 to 9 months in the sea. And that's what we are trying to avoid, that happens. So they should release those constraints. Now, the other important thing is prices. And the FAO food price index is at 96 points in August, which is still down 30% from its February of 2011 peak, although we have seen an increase. But it's important to mention that that increase is not the same as the peak times. So for example, in August 20, in the whole index is 96. The peak in February 2011 was 138, so it's 30% less. The case of cereals, in August 20, we were at 99. The peak was in 2008, in June 2008 at 160. So there is a 38% decline. In oils, 99 today, 175 in 2011, 44% below. And so on. So in all the commodities, we are not at the highest peak, so we are significantly lower than that, which means that prices are doing okay. Our expectations of what will be happening and where we need to put emphasis in the future is on high-value commodities. Why? Because there will be a recession, and we are already starting to face a recession. The GDP decline of the world is supposed to be minus 4.8. Although we are starting to see recovery, as it was mentioned before, still the recovery is not what should have been. So it's not a V like we expected initially. It's a U shape, and the base of the U is prolongating. Now, what this means there will be a reduction in the demand of high-value commodities in the key exporting countries, and that's something that we need to look carefully, because that could increase food losses, especially in left in the field, as a result of that. And let me just finish in two other elements. One is the development of prices of the oilseed sector, and also the development of prices of inputs, which is linked to oil prices, which are still low, and because of the recession, that will continue to be low. And that affects not only the prices of fertilizers, which will be cheaper, which is good for producers, but also affects the capacity of countries of being able to import goods. But at the same time, we need to understand that there was one source of demand of cereals, which was biofuels. And if oil prices are so low, biofuels are not competitive, and therefore we won't have that demand of biofuels. And that's something that we need to look at carefully. So the situation is, of those elements, we are very comfortable in terms of food availability. The problem is of demand is food access. And that's where we are really concerned, both in high value and staple commodities. The capacity of individuals to be able to consume in a world which already we have 690 million people undernourished, with a potential increase on 132 more million people undernourished because of COVID-19, which means that the availability, the access of food will be the major concern where we need to put our major efforts in the future. Thank you. So first of all, I think it's important to understand that agriculture is moving into a world which is under uncertainty. What COVID-19 has shown to us that is not only we have to respond to the population growth and therefore to the more demand of food, to the climate issues, not only to that we are using intensively our natural resources, but also that there is the surprise factor. And the surprise factor is becoming every time more important. What this means is that our sector has to become more resilient to those type of shocks. And we are not used of an agriculture to operate under uncertainty. Although farmers have to manage climate risk and so on and so forth, but these shocks, this component of shocks that we were never expecting, farmers knew that climate can change and they can cope with that. They have learned how to cope. But these new type of shocks that come from nowhere is something that we were not using in agriculture. So we need to work in a different way, think in a different way, and increase resilience. One element of resilience is trade. I think trade is central for us to be resilient. And as it has been mentioned, it's good news that we have been able to be in a situation where trade restrictions and trade barriers have been lowered. 22 countries, as I mentioned initially, now we are close to zero. In 2007, 2008, we had 33 countries, which meant 20% of the value of the production being trade. That was the difference, a big difference in the 2007, 2008. So trade is important, but not only international global trade, intra-regional trade is a huge source of demand that we cannot lose. And today we don't have that. Many regions don't have that. Even Caribbean islands, which are facing a huge shock today because they are dependent on foods, they're net food importers. They also depend on remittances, which are going down, and they are dependent on tourism, which is basically not happening and won't happen in the next year, most of it at least. They don't have interregional trade. Africa, they have the free trade agreement for Africa, the FTC, but they don't have yet a mobility of goods intra-regionally. It's incredible that if I need to import a commodity, it will be cheaper to get it from a different continent than to get it through in the same continent. Central America, another case, is if I want to get beans, I will go to Colombia rather than to go to Guatemala if I am in Honduras. So again, interregional trade is something that we need to increase because it will create a new source of demand and it will allow us to do that. For that, we need not only to focus on the tariffs, but also to focus on non-trade barriers. And NTBs are important, and NTBs are also related to food safety issues. And here's where we need to do and take this as a huge opportunity to accelerate improvement of food safety issues. Africa is trying to pursue with the African Union and trade ministers the Pan-African Food Safety Agency, and we need to support that. We need to work so that the Pan-African Safety Agency is operating so that we can accelerate the interregional trade and other forms of non-tariff barriers. The second element that I think is central to increase resilience is to improve infrastructure. What we have seen in the COVID-19 is that the infrastructure is central. Logistical issues, we were not ready to track real-time logistical issues. Now we are tracking real-time logistical issues. But clearly we need to find a way to accelerate and to improve the networks of infrastructure. That goes from road, airport, shipping infrastructure, up to a situation of storage facilities. If a farmer needs to cope with the time because of a shock and needs to wait to sell to later, he needs to have access to storage facilities. And that goes from dry to cold storage facilities. Africa is not well prepared for that. Even Latin America in many countries is not well prepared for that. So it's something that we need to work very closely to accelerate that process. We are trying to find ways in which we can optimize the location of those facilities, because the idea is not only to have the facility for farmers to be able to cope with the risk, but it's also to be able to allow them to link to financial markets, like, for example, through a modern warehouse receipt system that is completely electronic and is linking farmers to financial system through e-tickets from the warehouse that you can put in a bank, and the bank will allow you to do factoring, basically to get some liquidity in exchange of that food that is in the warehouse system. But inclusive, no? Inclusive means that small farmers and farmer associations will be able to access to that. And information asymmetries can be minimized using ICT technologies. So again, it's another option, and technologies could help on this. ICT could help on this. And that's where we can also increase resilience. Now, what we are expecting to happen first is the commodity that will move closer to cities is vegetables. So vegetables in the world trade map is a commodity that moves the shorter distances today. And what we will be seeing, and we are already seeing, is a move towards production of vegetables closer to big cities or intermediate cities. And the reason is because we can do control environments, which are cost effective, and that will supply cities. And that will be a response to what we observe and what has happened because of COVID-19, which already was happening, but will be accelerated. The second element is that we will see a significant increase in automatization. And that's good, but bad also. Why? Because most of the changes will have to happen in what we call the food processing part. So packaging, services, and transportation. And this was mostly female, so gender bias. It was females doing this work. And now this is going to be automatized, and automatized very fast. And what will happen with that labor force, okay? The velocity in which we are moving to automatization won't allow us to keep the track and to keep the speed to be able to have the labor supply trained for those needs. And that's something that we need to think very carefully, and it's something that we will need to find ways in which we can accelerate the training and building capacity so that the labor supply will match that new labor demand. And the final element is internet and the velocity in which we're going to move into access to e-commerce, for example. But we need to understand that although that will help to shorten distances, it needs 4 conditions. You need to have connectivity, you need to have the platform, you need to have mobile money, which some continents like Africa already has, M-Pesa, for example. And you also need to have the mail system, the transportation system to move the commodity. That's where most of developing countries fail. They could have connectivity, some connectivity, they could have the platform, they could have, in many cases, mobile money, but they don't have the capacity to move goods. So we need to be realistic of what can be feasible and what we can do and what we need to change. But just to finalize, I think this crisis has to be taken as an opportunity. It will be a mistake to keep pushing resources through subsidies to producers and so on without having a productive link to it. If I'm going to do a public works program to reactivate the economy, that public works programs have to be linked to investment in infrastructure that is needed for the productive sectors. If I'm going to subsidize something, it has to be a temporal subsidy that will end into something better. Like, for example, storage facilities. It's okay to subsidize them initially, but then there will be an investment that will pay a profit. So we need to be very smart in the way we do this type of if not, we're going to increase distortions and the situation will be even worse. It's another way of putting reducing competitive markets. So again, anything that will help us to increase competitiveness, to increase efficiency, reducing losses and waste, which is central in this process, I think will make us more resilient. And that's what we need to do to live under this world of uncertainty, which is basically an options world. Thank you. Okay, that's a pretty complex question. That's part of the role of Agricultural Market Information System, AMIS. They track the existence of stocks. So the AMIS basically have, since the G20 of Paris and reinforced by the last G20, by the current G20 of Saudi Arabia, is basically enforcing their capacities to be able to collect the information at the country level. So AMIS brings together the key exporting countries and the key importing countries of staple commodities. And they have been collecting the information on the stocks. So that's why we have up-to-date information of stocks. Now, if the stocks are distributed evenly around the world or not, that's a complex question. Most of the stocks right now are held in China and in other countries of the world, key big exporting countries, and they are at a significant high levels, which put us in comfort. Why it's important to understand that? Because small countries to have storage facilities to stock for price stabilization is a mistake. We know that creates distortions. It's very difficult to implement. It creates significant losses, and countries don't have the capacity to be able to stabilize prices. On the contrary, when we are talking of global stocks, which is basically the aggregate of all the big countries that have stocks, allow us to have a buffer mechanism in which we can facilitate access to food in situations of crisis. In 2007, 2008, the level of stocks were too low, and that was a major problem. We didn't have that buffer. Today, that's not the case. So it doesn't matter where they are. What it matters is how much they are, and that they will be able to move across borders through free trade arrangements. I think that's important, the important thing to think. Understand that we are in a world where the exports of staple commodities are highly concentrated. They depend on 5 or 6 countries. They concentrate most of the exports of staple commodities. Therefore, if that food flows, that's okay. It's better than 2007, 2008, where 3 or 4 countries were concentrated. Now we have more, especially the southern corner of South America, which has increased the capacity of exporting staples. So again, I don't think we need to worry where they are physically are. Okay, I think we need to worry how much they are at the global level, and that we allow commodities to move across borders.